Okay, we got our own puppets ready, and the channel is fully set up, so we can finally start our YouTube career.
But how are people even going to know we exist? Hmm?
Damn, that's more than 1,000. I may not make a vampire clip to any evil, but I will make a map. And when I say I really mean we, cause you're gonna help me make it.
Welcome, wandering souls, to our puppet factory. My name is Jen.
And I am Arth. Today, we'll be showing you how we made our section of Daria Cohen's When You're Evil Anijam.
We'll show you how we made everything for our Duke puppet and our infinite hallway set. Before even starting our puppets, it's very important to lay on some foundations for its construction. To get this, we basically had to watch all Daria's videos many times, looking for frames where we could catch any particular detail, such as how he looked from the front, from his side, and details of his clothes and anatomy. Once we had everything figured out, I drew a reference sheet for Duke in his front and side view. This was the sheet we will use as a base during all our construction process. We decided to make Duke's body 14 inches from head to toe.
The first thing we built was the armature using animation wire. I simply cut a couple of wire pieces according to our reference and twisted them to make basic structure. I made all the limbs a little bit longer so I could cut them later into the right size. Where the body and arm wires joined, I applied a big ball of epoxy putty to give his chest some volume and bind both of the wires. Once it was dry, I began applying polymer clay to give the chest its signature polygonal shape. To perfect the shape, I had to apply, bake, and sand the polymer clay on the chest many times. Usually puppets have their rigs close to the hips. However, because this puppet would have a long cape that required mobility, putting the rig in his hips would make the VFX a living hell. That's why we decided to place the rig higher in his back. That way, he would be able to hold Duke without losing mobility on the cape. To do this, I cut 1 cm of bronze tube and drilled a hole in the back of my chest piece. To join the metal piece to the chest, all I did was fill the inside of the piece with plasticine and prepare a little bit of resin to fill the hole in his back and introduce the bronze piece into the hole. And I emptied the remaining resin on a crab mold we always have lying around. After a short while, the resin would harden permanently, joining the metallic piece to the puppet. To unite the legs and his feet, I simply used nuts and bolts. First, I cut a dent in the sides of 2 nuts, then opened the wire tips of his leg and superglued them into the nut dents. I put both screws in to make sure I wouldn't seal the inside and covered them in epoxy putty. Once it was dry, I sanded down the surface and began to work on the feet. I made 2 new wire braids for his feet. I opened the tips once more and wrapped them around the screw's head. Then I covered the union with more epoxy putty. I cut some pieces of thinner bronze tubes for the unions between the arms and hands, and stick them to the body armature with more epoxy putty. While the epoxy hardened, I used a little bit of wood glue to put 2 sponge pieces in the body. Then I cut all the excess of the sponge and covered it with a little bit of cotton. Finally, I covered his torso using cloth tape until the body had a uniform surface. Now the body was ready to cover with silicone. I placed the body on an animation clamp and extended his limbs. For this step, I used a cheap tin silicone that is usually very thick. What I did was dilute it with mineral spirits and add a lot of catalyzer. Then I applied it all over the body's surface. Because we mixed the silicone with mineral spirits, this layer will shrink down for the next couple of days, making the silicone wrap the body much like a thin layer of skin. 2 days later, we sanded the silicone a little bit to smoothen the surface and then applied a second coat of shrinking silicone. Once this layer was done shrinking, Duke's body was now finished.
While he worked on Duke's body, I took charge of sculpting the head. First, Arthur made a simple wire base. He bent a main wire piece from the head and a second thinner wire that crossed sideways from his ears. He joined both wires with a bit of epoxy putty, and once it was done, I wrapped the structure with tinfoil. Then I applied the first layer of polymer clay just to get the general shape. Once the head had a reasonable shape, I popped it in the oven to harden the polymer clay. I sanded down the shape and began a long cycle of sculpting, baking, sanding, and repeating to get a proper head shape. Once the head shape was done, I used some cloth tape to cover it and drew the shape of his hairline on top of it. I cut the cloth tape and removed the hair section. Then I traced the outline on the sculpt itself. While I was doing this, I noticed that the position of the wires wasn't matching our reference sheet, so I had to remove them. I sculpted the outline of the hairline, and after another bake and some sanding, I began to work on his nose. Like before, I once more entered the sculpt, bake, and sand cycle until I managed to have a well-defined nose and also sculpted his goatee with some extra volume. Once that was done, we gave the ears another try. We drilled 2 new holes and put the new wires inside them. We reinforced the base of the wire with polymer clay and tried to sculpt the ears. The overall shape of the ears wasn't very complex. However, thinning the inner part turned out to be quite complicated. The sculpted ears broke twice. That's where I decided to clear out my head by working other head details for a while. I covered the head with gesso to fill some tiny imperfections on the surface. Now the head was complete. There was nowhere to run but to finish those ears. What I did was first make some thin epoxy putty sheets in the shape of an ear and place them on a roll of tape to give them a little curvature. Once they had hardened, I put them on the head with more epoxy putty and I used a little bit more to perfect their shape. The head was finally complete. We only needed to give a coat of paint and patch some imperfections using car filler, and his head was ready for its mold.
First I made our clay base carefully following our parting line. Then I polished the shape, smoothened the surface, and made the holes for all our keys. Then I cast silicone in many layers. Before it hardened, I put 3 pieces of previously casted silicone for it to work as keys for the plaster shells. Then I applied some plaster to make the outer shell. Once it dried, I turned the mold around, removed the clay, and applied a thin coat of Vaseline before covering it once more with silicone. Like the last time, before it hardened, we added the keys and then applied the plaster for the outer shell. After a short while, the mold was ready to cast some heads. In a big cup I prepared some white resin. I separated a little bit, added catalyzer, and applied a thin coat on both sides with a brush. Then I closed the mold, casted a little bit more resin into the mold through the sphere, and started turning it around to make the resin inside flow all around the inside surface.
For the final details of the head, I sculpted 2 small eyebrows on the head with epoxy putty.
Meanwhile, I made some tiny eyeballs with plasticine. I put them a couple of seconds in the oven to smoothen the surface. Once the surface was all smooth and shiny, I surrounded the eyes with plasticine and casted resin to make a hard mold. Once the mold was ready, I removed the plasticine from inside the mold with some cotton swabs, and then casted some intense red silicone into the mold. With this mold, it was very important to remove all excess material with something flat, like a card or a sheet of paper. And that's how we made his tiny and smooth red eyes. We drilled a hole in the bottom of the neck so the wire of the body could enter the head. Then we painted the head with some skin tone and black for the hair. And now for the hair, we tested our brand new flocking machine. On top of a tinfoil bed, I applied a little bit of glue on the scalp, and with the machine we applied some hair fibers on the surface. Finally, his head was done. To make the hands, I began with a thin wire base with a little bit of epoxy putty on the palms. Then I covered them very roughly with plasticine. Slowly and carefully, I kept detailing the hands to perfect their shape.
And once the shape was well defined, we polished the sculpture surface with thinner and lighter fluid.
With the hands done, we began working on our 2-part ultra-cowl mold. On a piece of plastic, we put a bed of pottery clay and the hands on top. Then we surrounded the hands with more clay. making a horizontal surface. We put walls to the mold and extended the clay towards them. We spent a long time polishing and flattening the clay surface with water and brushes. Then we prepared our ultracal and casted it in the mold. Once the hand sculptures were covered, we cut a square of burlap and put it on top of the mold before casting the rest of the ultracal. The next day, we opened our plastic box, turned the mold around and removed all the clay and the keys. Then we went to clean the remaining clay in the sink. After plunging the mold in water and cleaning it with a brush, it was ready to cast the other side. We rebuilt the container box, placed the mold inside, and glued the walls together. Then we sealed the edges with plasticine, applied a coat of Vaseline on the mold surface, and casted more ultracal. Once more, adding a little piece of burlap in the middle of the cast. Later, we tore apart the plastic box, opened the mold, and very carefully removed the plasticine hands from the inside. Now I needed to make a second wire armature for the silicone hands, this time using animation wire. Using a drill, I made some wire braids and put tiny balls of epoxy putty in the palms. Also, I binded the bronze pieces that would fit into the pieces of the body. Then I prepared a couple of grams of silicone and applied a coat on top of the wire armatures. While that dried, I put a little bit of car wax on the ultracal mold and prepared some silicone to apply a thin beauty layer on the mold. Then we catalyzed the remaining silicone and casted all of it inside the mold. We put the armatures in the mold and then closed it. The following day, we opened the mold and took out the hands. Then, with a little bit of extra silicone, filled a couple of air bubbles that the hands had near its surface.
Now that the hands, body and head were done, we began to work on all the props that carries. We made his hat, the staff, his key necklace, and lastly, two solid cups we used to give the sleeves the shape of the original design.
The next thing we worked on was the key. To make such a small piece, we used shrinkable plastic. We printed a 4 cm tall key to trace so that it would shrink to more or less 2 cm on the oven. First, I traced the outline on the plastic and then began cutting the edge with an X-Acto knife. Once I finished cutting, I put it in the oven at 100 degrees centigrade or 300 Fahrenheit for a couple of minutes. After it shrunk, I very carefully sanded a couple of small details like the edges and the bow. When the key was ready, I prepared a bit of silicone and casted a mold of the key. As soon as it was solid, I casted many resin copies. I sanded their edges and finally, the one we liked the most, we spray painted it, put a black string through the bow, and it ended up hanging from Duke's neck. For the cuffs, I began sculpting 2 epoxy putty cylinders, closed one cap on each, and then cut the excess height. Then I sanded them before drilling a hole in their center and used the drill heads as a base to sculpt tubes for Duke's hands to pass through. Then I used our Dremel to grind the inside of the pieces to make them lighter and thinner. While doing this, one of my pieces broke. Anyways, I liked the other one better, so I decided to later make a mold for it to cast pieces whenever they were needed. For Duke's staff, I began carving a chopstick to use as a base. Then I covered the stick with epoxy and put a ball on top for the cane head. Bit by bit, I kept adding epoxy to the cane and sanding it to perfect the shape. Once the shape was okay, I simply added the ears. For the wings, I first drew the shape on paper and traced them with thin sheets of epoxy putty. Once their wings were hardened, I put them on the cane itself with more epoxy and perfected the wing shapes. Eventually, the cane was ready for its mold. I made both the cane and cuff molds at the same time. First, I made each of them their plasticine base and walls, and made tiny holes to work as keys. Then I prepared some silicone to apply, first with a brush and then filling the rest of the mold. After they hardened, I turned them around, applied a coat of Vaseline, and put back the plasticine walls. Once again, I prepared more silicone and casted the second side of the mold. Once the molds were ready, I opened them, removed the original pieces, and cut away the mold's irregular borders. To cast many pieces, I prepared a bunch of white resin and began to cast many copies of each piece. I made 4 cuff pieces and coated them all with white spray paint. Then I painted them with acrylic and finally sanded them to make their surface perfectly smooth. For the cane, I had first to remove all the seam lines of the mold and covered the head to spray paint the base black. Then I covered the bottom part and sprayed the head with grey. It was here when we noticed a big problem. We put our almost final staff next to Duke and it looked way too tiny. It looked like a toothpick next to him. So we had to do some magic to make the staff bigger. When you leave a silicone mold submerged in mineral spirits, they will get bigger. However, the spirits will later evaporate and the mold will shrink back. What we did was letting sit the mold in mineral spirits for about 6 hours, and the mold grew bigger, into a more reasonable size for the staff. While the mold was still big, I quickly casted many resin copies. Then we painted our new extra large staff with black and grey, and also applied red vitriol paints for the eyes.
I put the red ribbon around the top, trying to make the wrinkles have a nice and interesting shape. Then I pasted it and I used a wine color Sharpie to highlight some shadows.
Meanwhile, I made a smear frame of the cane for when Doug twirled it. I drew a circle in a sheet of paper and saw how I wanted the curvature of the smear to look. Then, I put the cane on top of my little diagram and sculpted flat epoxy putty extensions. The bottom extension I sculpted directly on top of the cane, but for the other side, I sculpted it separately, carving a bat-shaped hole in the middle of it. And once it dried, I joined it to the cane. On the head side, I also added extra volume to the smear to simulate the shapes of the ribbon, the bat head and the eye. Then, with a Sharpie, I painted some movement lines and carved the shape using our drum. Then I simply painted it and this was the final result. The last and probably most complicated of his props was his hat. Once the head was done, we used a piece of insulating foam to make the general shape of the hat. Then we covered it with epoxy putty to get its general shape and kept working on it, trying to get it as similar as possible to Daria's drawings. It took many attempts and failures, but after a while, we got the hat to look alright. We made the mold just like the other silicone molds. First we made a plasticine base and made its keyholes. Then I applied a thin coat of silicone as a beauty layer and then put a cut-in-half plastic cup to use as walls for our mold. I prepared more silicone and casted it from the top. Once it hardened, I turned it around and made a new plasticine wall. I painted the edges with Vaseline and prepared more silicone and casted the mold. After a while, I opened the mold and took out the epoxy hat. Because I had struggled to get it out of the mold, I made an incision on the back of the mold so the resin pieces would come out more easily. To cast many hats, first I prepared a lot of pitch black resin. I took a small amount out and casted it inside the big side of the mold and began turning it around for the resin to cover it all on the inside. Once it had hardened a little, I prepared some more resin and used it to paint all the wing sections of the hat. Once it was all well coated, I closed the mold down and once more rotated it for the inside resin to flow around. After a while, I opened the mold and saw how the piece was looking. With our final hat piece, we only needed to sand down the seams and fill some imperfections with epoxy putty.
Just like with the staff, I put the red ribbon around the hat, keeping in mind the shape of the wrinkles, and once more, highlighting shadows with Sharpie.
Then came what was probably the hardest part of all. Clothes. The first thing we did were the shoes. Before the shoes themselves, we needed a structure to make the feet's general shape. To do this, I began tracing two pieces for the inside of the foot and sculpting them with polymer clay. Once they were done, I traced their center with a Sharpie and made a plasticine mold base. In order to have the wire braid passing through the mold, I put two plasticine cylinders on its ankles and between the two pieces. Then, once the mold surface was defined, I made a mold just like all the last ones. After making the first side, I removed the green plasticine, but not the brown one, because that was where the wire would be going through. Once more, I put silicone on top, and my mold was done. Before casting the resin, I had to make sure the wire was the right length. With some of the remaining black resin, I casted both sides of the mold, put the wire in, and closed it. It was important to let the resin harden enough for it to keep its shape, but not to fully harden. Once it was a little bit hard, I took out the piece and removed all the excess resin that was covering the central wire. That way, the feet would still have some flexibility. Then I simply repeated the process for the second foot, also removing the kinda soft resin from the center wire. Once the pieces had hardened, I put a bit of wood glue on the wires and 2 sponge pieces, so the middle of the foot didn't end up empty. Then I cut all the excess sponge with scissors and covered it all with masking tape to cut the shoe patterns.
I traced all the cuts where the shoe pieces will be separated, and then cut them out with scissors. I made a 2-piece pattern for the shoes and began cutting the faux leather. I folded all the pieces where it was needed and put them on the top of the feet to see how they looked. Once I saw the pattern work, I put a little bit of super glue on the pieces and I used cloth pins to hold the shoes while it dried.
While Jen worked on the second shoe, I began making an epoxy putty heel for the shoes. I sculpted the general shape, then sanded down the sides a lot. Once the heel shape worked, I made a very simple silicone mold and casted more black resin into it to make identical heels.
Before putting on the heels, I cut 2 soles out of a foam sheet and glued them to the bottom of the shoes. Then, for the finishing touch, I put a drop of super glue on each shoe and attached the heels. Now the shoes were finished. For the rest of the clothes, the first thing we needed to do was to cover his body with cloth tape. I covered his chest first to get the shape of his jacket. I assembled a general shape and put the hands on the body, so I could make the sleeves long enough to reach his wrists. I made his pants using masking tape. The first thing I cut down were his pants. I extended both pieces on a paper sheet and traced the outline. I drew the cutting lines on the jacket and managed to cut it into 6 pieces, which I also extended on a paper sheet. First, I made the easiest piece, his pants. I traced the shape of the pattern on black satin, leaving an additional border to fold the patterns and join the pieces. Then, with the mini iron and some melt adhesive tape, I fold the edge inwards. Then, I put a long strip of the melt tape along the leg. I pinned it to the body and slowly ironed the edges on each leg. Once both pants were done, I just joined both pieces in the hips with more tape and the iron. His pants were now done.
For the cape, I first designed the shape in blue towels and then cut a sheet metal piece into its shape. Because one sheet wasn't enough for the cape, I had to cut many pieces and glue them. I also used masking tape to cover the edges of each sheet so it wouldn't damage the cloth on top. Once the sheet armature was done, we traced the outline on our black velvet and red fabric to cut their patterns. First, I tried to glue the cloth with clear glue, but by the time I managed to cover all the surface, some sections were already dry. So we decided to use spray glue instead. First, we glued the black velvet and folded the edges around the sheet metal. Then, for the red piece, we folded it and ironed it before gluing it to our aluminum piece.
Finally, for his jacket, we did the same thing we did with the pants. First, we traced the pieces in the fabric, we pinned them and glued some edges with our iron, then pinning it to duct and carefully ironing the edges together. With this, our puppet was finally done. We could have animated him on a neutral abstract background, but we decided to take the hard path and make something more interesting, recreating the main hallway of the Vampire series shorts. Our plan was to try using mirrors to make a small hallway seem infinite.
I used the fiberboard we had lying around for the floor, and from a big cardboard sheet I cut 2 pieces the same size of the floor to use as walls. Then I covered all of them in a layer of plaster. Once the walls were well dry, I sanded them a bit to make the surface smooth. With this, our base was ready. Then we cut long strips out of an insulating foam board to make the columns. We cut 6 columns. 4 would be in the middle of the wall, and the last 2 would be split in half and put on the edges next to the mirrors. We sanded all sides of the columns until they were all the same size, and then sanded the edges to get a nice 45-degree bevel on their corners.
I applied a couple of gesso layers to the columns to get them to have the same material texture as the wall.
To support our walls, I made some corner pieces with grey cardboard. I cut a bunch of triangles and glued them in sets of 3. These pieces would be used to support the corners of the set. We put some red paint all over the floor, walls and columns. I also prepared some dark brown paint and painted 2 cardboard stripes that we would use for the balcony roof as seen in the videos. We used our pasta machine to make long sheets of epoxy putty, cut them in stripes and put them all at the edges of each column. Once they were dry, we sanded them down a little bit and painted them in an intense yellow color. Then we applied some extra colors with dry brush such as light brown or wine to give the color a bit more depth.
We began working on the lamps. It was hard to pick a design because they seem to change in every single shot of the series. In some of them, they have 1 flame each, in others they have 2. Sometimes there is 1 in every column, sometimes there are 2. Finally, after playing the night 1,000 times, we found the shot with 2 lamps per column and 1 flame each. The design seemed to bend 90 degrees on the corners and had a V-shaped decoration and a vertical goblet that held the flame on top.
We chose to go for that lamp. The first thing I did was drawing the shape of the lamp on an extra column we had. I traced my drawing with epoxy putty, trying to give it some sharp edges on the middle of the shapes. Then I placed the goblet and united the base and the goblet with a long epoxy putty tube. After they hardened, I sanded the hell out of them to make them really smooth, and then they were ready for molding. The V mold was a bit unusual. I made the mold in sort of an open book shape. First, I placed the silicone on one side, and while it hardened, I made a traditional mold for the goblet piece with a plasticine division. Once the first side of the V was solid, I turned it 90 degrees and made the second side. Then I simply made the other piece for the centerpiece mold. To cast all the lamps, I prepared a big amount of jello resin, and every time before casting, covered the inside of the mold with golden powder. For the goblet mold, I simply put resin on both sides and closed it quickly. Meanwhile, for the V pieces, I had to cast one side first, wait for the resin to harden a bit, and then turn the mold 90 degrees and cast the other side. I repeated this casting process 12 times for both pieces.
I took the lamps Arthur had casted and scraped off all the resin seams. I applied a little bit of vitamin of Judea to make the lamps look a bit older. For the fire, I sculpted 4 different flames that would look for the fire animation and gave them to Arthur to make a mold out of them.
I wanted all the flames in a single mold, so I placed the plasticine sculptures on a plastic box and surrounded them with plasticine walls. I prepared some silicone and casted it to fill up the mold. Once the mold was hard, I took out the plasticine flames and casted some transparent resin inside the mold. I casted 5 sets of 4 flames each.
I painted all the flames with vitriol paint, first applying an overall yellow coat and then adding details with orange and red.
For the fire to light up, we bought 12 LEDs, a breadboard, and a whole lot of cables. I peeled the wire of a 5-volt phone charger and connected it to the breadboard. I also put a dimmer on the system so we could regulate the light intensity while animating.
We drilled holes in the columns for the LEDs and their cables to go through, and with a spoon scooped a hole in the back of the columns. We drilled bigger holes where the columns will be located and put in place all the respective LEDs and cables. We glued the columns to the walls using wood glue, passing the cables through the holes in the wall. To let them dry, we put some books on the top of the columns for extra weight. Next day, we glued the triangle pieces to the floor of the set. We cut a long red velvet rectangle for the carpet in the middle. Put some double-sided tape on the edges and folded them inwards. We placed the carpet on the set, sticking it to the bottom with some duct tape. We placed on both sides of the red carpet this red elastic with golden sparkles and also taped them to the back with duct tape. We glued the rear mirror to the back part of the set and then put the ones on both sides.
I connected all the LEDs to our breadboard from where I could control the dimmer.
Meanwhile, I glued the lamps on each column right below the LEDs. The last thing we did was the 4 curtains. First, I cut big squares of purple velvet, folded the bottom edges and glued them with them. I made holes to the top section of the curtain and put a skewer through the holes. Then I used cloth pins to hold all the pins in the curtains and press them down with the iron.
I took charge of all the crisscross valances on the upper part of the curtain. First, I cut circles on the velvet and cut each in half. Then, I cut them into half-circle stripes of reducing sizes. I ran all the stripes through the middle and put them one inside the other. I cut some sheets of plastic into the shape of the valance and glued the stripes one by one. First one half and then the other. And now it was ready.
We put all the curtains in place and put the fake mirror in position.
Then came the best part, animation. We did set and character animation separately, because they both were different scales. I called a good friend of mine named Mo Avendaño. At any given frame on Instagram, go follow him. He helped us out positioning the lights and the camera. We started with the set. He placed the key light straight on top of the set and two harder lights casting towards the walls. On the set, we only needed to animate 12 frames. I began taking the pictures and slightly lowering the light intensity in each frame. Every 2 frames, I moved all the flames one position forward to make them look alive. This is how it looked in the end. Another good friend of ours, Jin's Builds, YouTube link in the description, took these plates and did some VFX magic to remove all the borders of the mirrors. We then called Mo again to help us set the lighting and camera for the puppet animation setup. We put Duke on a blue screen with a lighting similar to what we did in the set. I animated all of Duke's movements and this is how it looked. You might notice the staff looks a bit weird. It's constantly blinking in and out of existence. While animating, I shot 2 different frames whenever Duke needed an external rig for his staff. This made the visual effects pipeline much easier later on. Then Mo helped me remove the blue screen in After Effects. However, I still had to erase some elements by hand, such as the rigs. Mo also helped me out make a fake shadow for the animation and adding some color correction.
The last thing was drawing digital mouths over his face, and finally the animation was done. It was a long and hard journey, but in the end we managed to make it.
We had a lot of fun making this 4-second animation, and the way everyone has reacted to the whole collaboration is simply stunning.
We would like to thank Daria for giving us such an amazing opportunity, and to thank all the incredible people who participated in this wonderful project.
Spending these last couple of months sharing progress, suggestions, encouragement and chit-chatting was really fun.
And finally, thank you to all of you who enjoyed what we did and who have been so encouraging, showing the love and excitement towards our hard work.
Did you like seeing the process behind it? Is there any other set, character or anything you would like to see us translating into stop motion? Leave it in the comments and we'll see what we can do. We're also beginning to figure YouTube stuff out, so if you have any suggestions or feedback on our video format, they will be very welcome.
Stop motion is very tough and time consuming. If you enjoy this process, consider subscribing and sharing our video with a friend. We have still got more things to show you, like how we made ourselves into puppets, and other secret projects on the making. Thank you all for watching our video. We hope to see you again.